but you can never leave.
July 31st, 1980. Long Beach Arena, California. No press release was issued that day. There was no warning for the audience. No one said this would be a special night. But the history of the Eagles stopped there. Outside the arena, the familiar lines of people, tour t-shirts, paper tickets folded neatly in hand, conversations about which songs they hoped to hear tonight. Hotel California, Desperado, Take It Easy. A band that had become the background sound of the entire United States throughout the 1970s. The Eagles were not just a band. They were a definition of success. Backstage, the atmosphere was completely different. No laughter, no small talk before showtime. The conflicts had existed for a long time, but that night they were no longer hidden. Disagreements over control, over roles, over who was carrying most of the pressure and who was enjoying most of the spotlight. These things did not explode in a closed-door meeting. They were carried straight onto the stage. The show began on time. Lights came up. The sound was flawless. For the audience, everything still looked like any other Eagles concert. A seasoned band, confident, controlling the stage with songs refined over hundreds of performances. But look just a little closer, and the cracks were already visible. Eyes that did not meet. Silences between songs that lingered longer than usual. Footsteps on stage no longer fully in sync. Then came the moment no one was prepared to witness. The argument happened right on stage, while the show was still in progress. Not a chaotic explosion, no physical violence, but it was precisely that restraint that made the situation feel colder. Words spoken just close enough for the other person to hear. Looks that did not hide condescension and anger. The audience could not hear every sentence clearly, but they could see one thing very clearly. The people standing before them were no longer a unified whole. The music was still playing, but the bond behind it had snapped. There was a moment right in the middle of the stage when two members looked straight at each other. Not the look of bandmates. It was the look of people who had gone together for too long and had no way back. Later, many would recall feeling a strange tension in the air, even if they could not precisely name what was happening. The show ended without a climax. No announcement, no sign of what was to come. The Eagles left the stage as if it were just another night on the tour. But in reality, it was the last time they would stand together on a stage for many years. There was no immediate breakup announcement, no tearful press conference. Only a prolonged silence, heavy and unsettling. What made the night of July 31st, 1980 special was not the volume of the argument, but its inevitability. The Eagles did not collapse because of failure, not because audiences turned away, not because the music became outdated. They collapsed because they had been winning for too long, because success turned every small difference into a major threat. Because no one was willing to step back anymore inside a machine that had been running at maximum speed for nearly a decade. This is not just the story of a concert. This is the moment a great band began to disintegrate in front of the public's eyes, though it would take many years before people called it by its proper name. The Eagles were not born from a romantic dream. They were born from work. In the early 1970s, Los Angeles was a machine. Studios, bars, small stages, record label offices, and last-minute calls asking someone to come in for a test session tomorrow ran through the city like tangled electrical wires. Young musicians survived by playing for hire, writing on commission, stacking gig schedules on top of each other, and waiting for a turn big enough to escape the role of standing behind the spotlight. Don Henley came from Texas, bringing with him a raspy voice, a sharp gaze, and the defensive instinct of someone who understood that fame could be a trap. Glenn Frey grew up in Detroit, accustomed to a hard rhythm of life, able to read a room, able to steer a narrative in his favor. Bernie Leadon was rooted in country rock, technically solid, with a bluegrass foundation, playing like someone who had learned the craft from a young age. Randy Meisner was quieter and softer, less talkative, but possessed a high harmony voice and a bass style that gave songs their structure. 4 people, 4 directions, 4 different ideas of what a band should be. They did not meet in a mythic moment. They met around Linda Ronstadt, a gravitational center of California's music scene at the time. At first, they were only a backing band. That detail matters, because when you begin in a supporting role, you learn 2 things: how to meet expectations and how to swallow your ego to finish the job. But the ego does not disappear. It simply learns how to stay still. In the early days, they rehearsed in hot rooms, guitar cables draped over chairs, amplifier cases stacked on top of one another, dry count-ins marking time. They learned how to blend voices so no one overpowered the others. They learned how to write choruses simple enough for radio, yet sincere enough not to dissolve into the crowd. And most importantly, they learned how to stand next to one another on stage without anyone having to bow too deeply. The debut album arrived like a gentle slide in the right direction. Their music was not too sharp, not too aggressive, not too disruptive to turn the public away. It was smooth enough for radio, honest enough to keep listeners engaged. California appeared in that music not as a sun-drenched postcard, but as long highways, towns stretched under the sun, the feeling of having just arrived and already wanting to leave again. Listeners found what they needed in it, a new voice that did not feel unfamiliar. Then success came faster than a group of people could reasonably stay in agreement. Tours stretched on. Every night repeated the same set list, but it had to sound better than the night before. Each song that reached the airwaves boxed you in one more time. The public wanted you to be what they had already bought. And the record label wanted you to sell more of it. In that environment, power roles began to take shape. Glenn Frey gradually became the coordinator, the person who decided the band's direction in meeting rooms, not just on stage. Don Henley increasingly controlled the message and the structure of the songs, like someone who did not believe in luck. Bernie Leadon began to feel himself drifting away from the country roots he believed in, watching the music pulled toward the mainstream and calculation. Randy Meisner often stood in between, hearing the tension, sensing it, but rarely stepping into direct confrontation. That silence allowed the band to keep functioning for a while longer. But silence is also how conflict accumulates, with no release. From the outside, the Eagles looked like a smoothly running machine. Long hair, leather jackets, warm yellow lights, harmonies braided together like a single thread pulling people back to a specific era. But on the inside, they were beginning to learn how to endure. Endure touring schedules, endure late-night studio sessions, endure arguments over which direction a guitar part should go, where a lyric should land, who should stand where so the camera could catch the best angle. Each step forward was a step higher, and the higher they climbed, the larger the void behind them grew. No one spoke of a breakup at this stage, but all the conditions for a fracture were already in place. Early success, multiple centers of power coexisting, a punishing work schedule, and an environment where not speaking up was often considered professional. The Eagles were rising, very fast, and they had not yet learned how to stop. The peak of the Eagles did not arrive with cheering. it arrived in a very dangerous silence. The silence of those who know they are winning absolutely. By the mid-1970s, the Eagles had become one of the biggest bands in the United States. Albums sold millions of copies. Radio could not avoid them. Their songs played in cars, in bars, in living rooms of a generation that believed America would always be this way: wide, wealthy, and unbeatable. Hotel California was not just a song, it was a declaration of power. Thicker, darker, more complex in sound. The Eagles were no longer an easy-listening country rock band. They stepped into the territory of those who controlled big stages, big budgets, and big egos. And it was here that the cracks became clearly visible. When success reached this level, every detail became an issue. Who received more credit? Who decided musical direction? Who had the final word in the studio? Glenn Frey and Don Henley tightened control more and more. Not because they hated the others, but because they believed the band could only exist with a clear axis of power. Don Felder did not see it that way. For Felder, the Eagles were not a corporation with an invisible board of directors. He was the one who brought sharp guitar elements, more complex musical structures, and the sense that the Eagles could move beyond their original safe image. But over time, that role was increasingly narrowed in major decisions. Studio meetings were no longer about music alone. They were about authority. Certain remarks were remembered for years. Certain looks were enough to understand that the relationship between bandmates had deformed. On stage, the Eagles were still perfect. Major tours followed one another. Set lists were optimized. Everything ran so smoothly that audiences noticed none of the tension behind it. But the more they played, the more trapped they became in their own success. Stopping meant losing momentum. Continuing meant enduring one another just a little longer. The culture of must go on became an unwritten law. No one wanted to be the first to say the obvious. The band was consuming itself from the inside. Because when all the numbers looked good, every warning sounded like a personal complaint. And in that world, the person who complained was often seen as the problem, not the problem they were pointing out. The Eagles entered their final phase not in public crisis, but in a state of over-control. Everything was held tightly. Emotions were compressed. Conflicts were never resolved, only postponed, until there was no room left to retreat. And the stage, once a symbol of absolute dominance, was about to become the place where everything broke in front of the public. The night of July 31st, 1980, Long Beach, California. On the schedule, this was just another contractual performance, a political fundraising event. The biggest band in America was invited to play, set the mood, then leave. No one noted that this night would end an era. But days before that, the Eagles were no longer the same Eagles. Years of touring had worn everything down. Control pressure, disputes over songwriting credits, money, power within the band. Glenn Frey increasingly held the central role. Don Henley backed him. Don Felder felt pushed to the margins, even though he was responsible for some of their most iconic guitar melodies. There were no longer open arguments, only sarcastic remarks, unusually long silences. Rehearsals where everyone did their part correctly, but no one looked each other in the eye. When they stepped onto the Long Beach stage, everything outwardly was perfect. White lights, clean sound, a full house. The Eagles, the public knew. But internally, the band had fractured. The performance followed the script. Familiar songs, harmonies rehearsed to the point of instinct. And that was what made it colder. They played like individuals standing next to each other, not a collective. The argument did not happen backstage before the show. It happened on stage. During the performance, Don Felder was said to have made sarcastic remarks aimed at Glenn Frey about the band having to play a political event. Words quiet enough to avoid the microphones, but clear enough for those nearby. Glenn Frey heard them, and he did not stay silent. While still singing, still holding the melody, Frey turned toward Felder. The response was not debate, it was a threat. Short, direct, leaving no room for retreat. A clear message that this would not end when the song ended. They continued playing until the final note. The audience applauded. The lights went out. No one knew that this was the last time the Eagles would share a stage for more than a decade. Backstage was no longer a place to maintain image. Instruments were set down, microphones removed. Those not involved left the room. Only people who had accumulated too much anger remained, with no reason left to hide it. There was no punch, no chaotic scene for headlines. But words now were sharper than any action. Things suppressed for years were finally spoken in a closed space. No audience, no contracts, no reason to keep the peace. After that night, there was no official breakup announcement, no press release, no farewell conference. Only a very simple truth. They no longer spoke to each other as a band. In the days that followed, phone calls took place in a cold atmosphere. Attempts at reconciliation quickly collided with bitterness that had not yet cooled. Trust had broken. And in a band built on control and power, once trust disappears, no structure can stand. The Eagles did not break up through a decision. They broke up through an evening, through words spoken while singing, through the realization that they no longer wanted and no longer could stand beside each other one more time. From that moment on, the Eagles were no longer a living band. They became a long absence, with each member walking their own path, carrying unresolved wounds. When the Long Beach night closed, the Eagles did not just leave the stage. They left the very formula that had taken them to the top. A perfect creative machine powered by friction. After 1980, the most unsettling thing was not silence. It was that people began to hear them more clearly through their solo work. Don Henley emerged as a cold-handed diarist, turning post-collapse years into songs of an era. Joe Walsh remained an electric spark, wild, humorous, and careless, but no longer trapped by band discipline. Glenn Frey chose another path: Hollywood, film soundtracks, acting, turning the California guy image into a character that could stand alone on screen. For listeners, the breakup did not happen in a single day. It stretched across radio waves, across greatest hits albums spinning endlessly in record stores, across long highway drives. Eagles' music lived on so persistently that their separation felt like a bitter joke. People still heard Hotel California. The band just was no longer there to hear itself. Then 14 years passed. In 1994, they returned, not as an emotional reunion, but like adults checking whether an old house still stood. The name Hell Freezes Over was a dry wink. Once they had sworn they would only reunite when hell freezes over. And then they did. From there, the Eagles entered a chapter longer than the legend itself. Steady touring, larger stages, multi-generational audiences, and old cracks not healed, only managed by new rules. But management is not healing. Later years still brought internal fractures into the light, especially legal disputes between Don Felder and the band after his removal in the early 2000s. That episode reminded audiences that behind harmonies smooth as glass, the Eagles were always a negotiation over power, money, and ownership of legacy. Then came 2016, a true cut. Glenn Frey died at age 67 after complications publicly acknowledged by his family. For many fans, that was the moment the Eagles could never truly return as before, because the band's narrative voice had gone silent. And the way they continued became an ethical choice: stop to preserve memory, or go on to prove the songs were bigger than any individual. They chose to go on. The stage lineup was filled by family and professional companions. Deacon Frey and Vince Gill stepping into positions everyone knew could not be replaced, only carried forward. And in recent years, even the concept of an Eagles farewell has stretched in a very American way. Farewell tours, residencies, added nights due to demand. Looking back, the tragedy of the Eagles does not lie in arguing on stage. It lies in this: they created music that sounded like refuge, but to build that refuge, they lived in constant tension. And in the end, what remains is not the arguments. It is the opening guitar lines, the precise harmonies, and the feeling that once there was a California to believe in. So for you, is the legacy of the Eagles greater in the music or in the lesson about the cost of perfection? And if you have ever witnessed a band you loved fall apart, share your thoughts in the comments and let us know.